As we know, ensuring the safety and health of well-being of animals is a high priority. It's an ethical obligation of the veterinary profession. We take an oath to do that. There's been a lot of changes to antibiotic use in animal agriculture, and particularly in the poultry industry in the US. I think about 50% of our production is now raised antibiotic-free, even though maybe only about 10% is marketed antibiotic-free. But certainly there's a lot of market pressures to, as you saw Brad Fracking explaining this morning, about raising antibiotics, animals without antibiotics. We've got growing demand, and there are concerns about potential conflicts between this obligation to maintain animal health and well-being while reducing antibiotic use. So the objective here was to survey veterinarians, producers and animal ag about experiences and opinions of raising animals without antibiotics. The survey was an online survey used by a platform called Qualtrics, and it was disseminated through various industry and veterinary professional groups. And it was done in the early part of this year and analysed by some of the usual tools. So just a little bit of the background of who was involved in this. And you can see here we're seeing the swine. So first thing to point out, this was done across all the major commodities. Most of the data that will be in the presentation is in swine. You can see that on the swine side, you can see total and swine, but on the swine side about a little under half were producers, and the other big group was veterinarians. And the respondents were stratified into two groups. There were people who actually had current or previously experienced, so that actually walked the walk of raising animals with antibiotics, and the other group were people who were surveyed, had opinions and perceptions, but actually didn't have any current or previous history of raising animals without antibiotic use, and they're what is termed the conventional respondents. So RWA are people who've done it, the conventional are people who've thought about it but not done it. So one of the questions was, why did you do it? Or in the case of the conventionals, why haven't you done it? And the first thing to look at, if we're looking at increasing sales price, gaining market entry, the overriding incentive, and this isn't surprising that people are doing this, is that there's that business opportunity that all the industries are looking at the moment, and all the customers, well, many of the customers are looking for. On the conventional, and the other thing is indirectly, the biggest thing was a direct response to a customer request and potential to get greater return for the animal sold, as we saw with the old-fashioned pork example. With respect to the conventional respondents, those that were concerned about negative impacts on animal health and welfare, that was the biggest issue, or the biggest barrier to people seeing why aren't we doing this if there's a market opportunity there, was indeed the purpose of the survey, which was to explore these perceptions about effects on animal health and welfare. And another very important factor, and is again, these are people presenting their opinions in an anonymous manner, so their identity wasn't tracked, and they were already raising animals in a responsible use program. And we know we have extremely high participation in our national PQA program, so obviously we would anticipate that a lot of our producers would say, yeah, I'm in a responsible use program, I'm not in a raised without antibiotics program. So again, there was a question related to the types of programs that were used, and again, where they were saying who they were linked with. So packer processor program was the biggest, and again, this is in swine, linked to downstream consumers. They were the overriding programs that they were participating in. Stratifying now by experience. In terms of participation, we can see in PQA very high participation in the conventional respondents, in those raised without antibiotics, and obviously they're a different group of producers is that we still have high but lower participation in PQA because they're involved in different programs. The other thing was a privately owned or facilitated animal welfare program that was they were participating in. One of the important issues as relates, particularly on the veterinary side, is what are the real or perceived problems from a health-wise perception that people are looking at. So this is a little bit complicated, and you can see on the left-hand side there, they were asked to rank these conditions and which ones were highest. So it's sort of a heat map. So the dark red on the top left is saying these were the things that we perceive to be or have experience of being the major problems, and they're not surprising to us. If we look at the conventional side there, A-suis, Haemophilus parasuis, strep suis, post-weaning E. coli, mycoplasma infection were the same. And if you look down below in the people who've had experience, the ranking is slightly different. E. coli was ranked more highly by the people with experience, but those three groups of diseases were either expected to be or had been the major problems in terms of dealing with health problems in raised without antibiotic production. And again, a little bit of the breakdown expressed another way on the right. We won't get into that one. This is sort of the same question, but rather than being directed at specific pathogens, and we had a lot of producers, not just veterinarians there, it was more a syndromic question. So what sort of problems are you looking at? And again, you can see, and it reflects what we saw before, respiratory disease problems were ranked highest and very similarly in both groups, followed by digestive disorders, CNS above, a little bit different. But again, as we know in pig production, respiratory enteric diseases are the large chunk. So we see agreement between those two groups there is that they're our predominant pieces of our disease. So here we're looking at impacts on production. So if we're going antibiotic-free, what's that going to mean? And again, we've got to remember that our raised without antibiotics people are people who are currently or previously done this. Our other group are people who have thought about but not done it. So it's expectations on the right-hand side and perhaps a combination of experiences and opinions and expectation on the left. And if we look, the light green there is showing that we're looking at a decrease. Yellow is no change. Increase, and the black is not sure. And you can see that the expectations in these two groups are actually pretty similar, that there'd be decreased and I think we mean worse feed efficiency there, increased morbidity, mortality, age at slaughter, weight at slaughter, not so much different. But I think you can see across all those groups, across all those categories, the conventional respondents were always a little bit higher than the people without the experience. So you can just see that the peaks for each of those categories, people who hadn't done it were perceiving it to be worse than people who had done it. Saw it as having been or their current understanding or expectations of it. But in all cases, there's an agreement there that when you shift to antibiotic-free production, there will be a production cost. And that obviously, if there wasn't, we'd all be doing that and be capturing the premium for the antibiotic-free market. So there is that trade-off there, perceived trade-off between having the flexibility to treat more freely and not having it. Oops, so let me go back there one. Another one here is changing management. Did you need to change management to be able to do this, or would you expect, again, to have to do it? And you can see there that those that had done it responded that there was the biggest group were looking at making changes in weaning age, particularly, and you can see personnel, biosecurity, space allowances. So the predominant response there was that they did have to make management changes to do it in these different areas. And similarly, paralleling again, and this isn't a surprise to anyone in the room, I think that when we do shift to that sort of take one tool away from controlling animal health, it needs to be compensated by management changes. Otherwise, we probably shouldn't have been doing it to begin with. So I think it makes a lot of common sense. But again, being able to quantify these perceptions in these different groups, I think, has been a very useful exercise. Now we're looking at what the respondent believes with respect to food safety, and here we've got all the major species there. So we've got the responses from the conventional and RWA groups, but within each of those respondent groups. And just to orientate you, the dark red is significantly worse, the dark blue is significantly improved, and we've got a gradation going through there. And the question being, how do you think raising with antibiotics impacts food safety? And you can see there's a fairly solid group in the middle that says no impact. We've got a fairly broad spread of opinion going from significantly improved to significant worse, but just perhaps and some perception differences between the species. So if you look at the broilers, they're more biased towards the left, the conventional broiler producers, and again, so a little bit different from the experience of those doing it. And then if we look down at perhaps the beef raised without antibiotics group, there are groups that are seeing that they're perceiving that going raised without antibiotics would have food safety benefits. The food safety benefits aren't specified. It's just a generic perception of what it means. So they probably could drill down and say, well, what do we really think that this would mean? This is a question where, rather than their own opinions, they were asked to give their opinions on what their perceptions of consumers or customers would be. And here you can see that it's a very different profile. So it's the question, how do retailers, restaurants, food service think raised without antibiotics impacts their food safety? And you can see our community thinks that our customers believe that there are food safety benefits to raising animals without antibiotics. And I think that this, I guess my own biases and a lot of the people I interact with, there is, we're hearing about these pressures, and you certainly read a lot about we're going to have safer food, and that's what consumers would agree. So our community believes that our customers perceive substantial benefits to food safety in raised without antibiotics programs. Remember, this doesn't mean that they do. It means that we think they do. Okay, I think, and I hope I'm not representing everyone who did the survey and responded to it. But okay, health and welfare. How do you think raised without antibiotics impacts animal health and welfare? And again, we've got all the species groups. We've got the conventional RWA and groups within each species. And here you can see we have a different picture. You know, the dark red block is much more dominant here. The blue side, the positive side of the list is very thin. The red side of the list is dominant. So we're across species and both with both respondent groups, we have a perception and in some cases experience of detrimental effects to animal health and welfare in raised with antibiotics. So it doesn't come without an animal health and welfare cost in through the eyes of people who've both done it across these species and people working in the industries and their anticipation. Perception of customer beliefs, and again we see a different thing. So what we're seeing here is that again our community thinks that these things can be done without the animal health and welfare costs that our community perceives in going. So, and this is, I think, a very understandable differences between very separate parts of society, and this is again our community's perception of customers' beliefs. So we think, and we have experienced that there's an animal health cost. The respondents don't think that the people downstream in the marketplace perceive the same concerns that they do with respect to animal health and welfare. Impacts on cost. And so this is question being, again, our perceptions across the species, and you can see it's pretty dominant. So here we've got a different colour scheme, significantly decreasing costs on the brown through to dark green, significantly increasing costs. That's a pretty, that one speaks for itself. I think I don't need to go into that. That across species, across experienced and inexperienced groups, this is not something that's not done without a cost to the financial cost to the production of the food animals in those cases. Impacts on demand. And then here you can see a very mixed bag, but again, not all that different among the species or among the groups within the species. And I think, except for the conventional dairy, and you can see that the dairy in general are seeing greater potential demand than in the other industries, certainly in the cattle generally than the monogastrics. And certainly we have a much more developed organic dairy industry in the US relative to organics in other areas. So there are differences between the industries, but generally overall, the overall perception is no impact or on the positive side. So we're seeing we believe there is demand for these products. And this is, I think, perhaps one that has got a lot of interest in the veterinary circles is there are times that maintaining a raised without antibiotics label has priority over flock or herd health and welfare. So this is where you have a disease break where you might want to treat the animals for health or welfare purposes, but if you use antibiotics in that group, those animals will become ineligible for the market that you're adding them to, and you have to have another outlet for them that will be not compensate you for your production costs you may have incurred. And here again we see from strongly disagree on the left to strongly agree on the right, the balance is weighted towards the fact that this is a dilemma that people will face if the price of treating means that they've got to incur the cost of not being able to obtain the premium for the market that they're shooting for. So I think it's an understandable again perception, and again similarities, both people who are doing this and people who have thought about it but not done it are pretty much in reasonably good alliance, so some differences between the species. There are times that maintaining a raised without antibiotics label has priority over herd health and welfare. Yeah, I didn't point out that this was veterinarians and producers, so just stratified rather than by across the industries, vets, bird producers. And you can see that there are quite some clear differences there between the certainly the raised without antibiotics and the conventional. The conventional, so the people who haven't done it disagree more with the statement than those who have done it. Okay, so perhaps our people not doing it think it'll be worse than it is. This is a question about the need for more auditing of systems for raised without antibiotics. And again, you can see across the I don't know the specific wording of the question, but there's a general tendency that these programs could benefit or should have a higher level of auditing about compliance than currently exists. So this is, again, perceptions of these groups, and you can see very consistent across the species groups and the experience groups that there's probably not as much auditing as people think should be in place. This is, of course, the $64 million question about antibiotics in use in my animals does not cause problems in humans. Strongly agree and strongly disagree from the brown-red through to the agree. And I think this would be an interesting question to have asked Bill's colleagues in pediatrics or the medical community or the general society is about what that perception is. But you can see that there's on balance, the opinion across the industries and across those groups is that they don't perceive it as, and again the question is problems, any problems. You know, again having a binary question like that is a little tricky, but our community appears not to hold the opinion that we are causing substantial problems in humans, and that obviously is an extremely contentious, debatable point. Antibiotic use in my animals will make it harder to treat infections in my animals in the future. And again, the strongly disagree to strongly agree. And if you look again, it's a sort of a mixed bag with this one, with opinion generally pretty balanced across both sides of the sheet. Though generally you can see the raised without antibiotics people. No, I think it's highly mixed between the species. So I probably need to sit down with Jennifer and Randy to try and understand really what we're taking away from that. Antibiotic use in my animals leads to bacterial infection in humans that are more difficult to treat. So really asking the same question another way and getting the same answer, so that our community is indicating that the opinion is that we're not at least a major part of the problem. I would be willing to treat my animals with antibiotic alternatives if they were equally effective. And I think we all know, and you know, that one is an overwhelming response. So I think the intent in the veterinary producer world is, we want healthy animals, we want to use less antibiotics, we're open to alternatives, and as you know, there's a very active market and a lot of research in the alternative there. The USDA is putting money into alternatives. I think from point of view of treating sick animals, we don't have a lot of successes, but there's a large number of products that are in development or being sold, particularly some of the generally recognized as safe compounds. They're out there. I think the difficulty is getting convincing reproducible data about the generalizability of the effects of these things. But certainly our community is very open, probably hungry for these types of alternatives. I know in Denmark, where I've spent a lot of time, they've been looking at alternatives for over 20 years, and I'll say they've got one or two that work, one or two that have promise, and don't hold your breath. So we're all encouraging people to bring them forward, but it's not as simple as people might imagine. So overall, across all surveyed commodities, the main reason for going to raising animals with antibiotics is market-driven to meet our customers, our clients, our society's demands. Though there was some sale price incentive, direct economic incentive, the main concern expressed by the conventional respondents was why they weren't doing it was these concerns about negative impacts to animal health and welfare. Most are already in a responsible use program, which is what our poor quality assurance program is. There's a huge discrepancy about what respondents believe and what their perceptions are about what the customers and retailers believe. So respondents across commodities think raised without antibiotics has a negative impact on animal health and welfare, whereas they think that the customer believes that they'll be improved. And also similarly, the difference we pointed out on food safety with respect to antibiotic-free. Across all the commodities, they agreed with the statement that their antibiotic use doesn't cause problems in humans, and disagreed with the statement that their use leads to infections being more difficult to treat. Across all surveyed commodities, respondents were mixed in their opinion regarding the relationship about their own antibiotic use and the ability to treat animal infections. Many respondents felt there are times when the label takes priority over animal health and welfare. And across all commodities, respondents generally felt there was a need for increased auditing of the system.